is Rico speaking. Rico. R-I-C-O, Rico. Little Caesar, that's who.
Well, Warner Brothers, particularly during the 30s and during the Great Depression, they were the gritty studio. They were, you know, doing the gangster films, doing the contemporary, the ripped from the headlines. And they had a great style, very staccato pace, and that became the house style. But this changed in the mid-30s. That's when the production code really got its teeth.
All the motion picture production companies in the United States have joined hands in adopting what has come to be known as a production code of ethics, that the vulgar, the cheap, and the tawdry is out. There is no room on the screen at any time for pictures which offend against common decency, and these the industry will not allow.
So you couldn't do some of the things that you were allowed to get away with in the early 30s. Well, Warner's wanted to change their image.
Warner's had been pretty much typecast as a maker of lavish Busby Berkeley musicals and of gangster pictures. Cagney and Eddie Robinson and George Raft, and they were in kind of a rut.
Is this the end of Rico?
Warner's felt that it was time now, let's get into the prestige area. And they wanted to expand the horizon and get into things that they really hadn't done for a while. So they thought of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Shakespeare play, and Max Reinhardt, the impresario, was doing a production of Midsummer Night's Dream at the Hollywood Bowl. And they worked out a deal where he would do a film for Warner Brothers based upon A Midsummer Night's Dream. And they thought, let's use the Warner Stock Company for Shakespeare. So here's James Cagney playing Bottom the Weaver, Joey Brown, who was a very popular comedian at Warner's at the time, and Olivia de Havilland, who had been in the Hollywood Bowl production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, was actually kind of discovered for that. Now, Robin Hood hadn't been discussed in any way, shape, or form at Warner's up to that point. Dwight Franklin was a man who was a period advisor and costume man, and he had come off of Midsummer Night's Dream, and he thought, what about Cagney for Robin Hood? And he said, I think he would be terrific, and we can use the rest of the gang, meaning the Warner's stock players, as the merry men. I've got a lot of ideas on this. Let me know if you're interested. Well, interestingly enough, Warner Brothers, they were interested. James Cagney was a very big star, and he was an extraordinary screen presence. I mean, you look at his material today, whatever it is, he's dynamic, and he's a thinking actor, and he captures the scene, whatever it happens to be. And Warner's knew that.
Oh, you heard me.
That's love.
Well, when Warner's decided to pursue Robin Hood, they discovered that they had the rights to the de Koven-Smith operetta of 1890 called Robin Hood. Now, meanwhile, crosstown, at opulent Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy are suddenly big hits in Naughty Marietta. And they think, you know, this is marvelous. We've got to do follow-ups, other operettas. So they started thinking about doing Robin Hood with Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. Now, they had bought some scripts from an independent producer by the name of Edward Small, some development scripts. But they discovered that, of course, Warner's had the controlling rights to the music. So they worked out a deal where Warner's could do a picture called The Adventures of Robin Hood. Metro would do the de Koven-Smith operetta of Robin Hood with Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald. By this time, everybody was happy because in the bargain, Warner's got some of those early scripts from Edward Small, so they thought that would help in the development of the material. And of course, MGM was happy because they got to use the de Koven-Smith material. So work proceeded. A writer by the name of Roland Lee was engaged to do an early version of the script. He was British, so Hal Wallace, the executive producer, thought, okay, let's give him a whirl. And he developed it, but Wallace was not thrilled with the first draft screenplay.
Hal Wallace, who was really a brilliant producer and an incredible storyteller, seemed to innately understand that you had to come up with something new. Some new characters, some new story turns and twists, but that would not discard the traditional elements that people associated with the story of Robin Hood.
The story of Robin Hood comes to us in many different ways. The first mention of Robin Hood goes back to 1377 in Piers Plowman, and it's just mentioned by name. Within the next century, people were telling Robin Hood stories, Robin Hood ballads. They weren't sung, even though they were called songs. And through the years, the stories of Robin Hood and the adventures that he had got bigger and bigger and more important to people. Robin Hood started out as a bit of a trickster, as someone who would trick people into fighting, to play jests. In fact, one of the earliest ballads that we know is called A Little Jest of Robin Hood. So he, in each age, gained certain attributes that were important to that age. When it became important for him to become more of the freedom fighter, then those are the stories that began to take on prominence. When it was important for a hero to be a nobleman, to be of noble birth as well as of noble character, he became a nobleman. When it became important for him to be a lover, a romantic figure as well, the character of Marion started to be in the story. So he took on the attributes that were important to each age and developed into eventually the swashbuckling hero and fighter of injustices that we think of today. And by the 19th century, Robin Hood had made his way into children's stories and became more of a hero. And in the 20th century, with the advent of film, you started to have films like the Douglas Fairbanks Robin Hood, and the story took on that grandeur that everybody held close to their heart when they first were hearing these stories.
Roland Lee was hired to do a draft of this Robin Hood movie. He approached it in a very different manner than Hal Wallis had in mind.
Now, he was suggesting that they leave out Maid Marian because she was not part of the original legend and ballads. Well, that didn't go over too big. They definitely wanted to put in Maid Marian. Also, he had a tendency to have rather flowery language, and Hal Wallis said, I don't want this. So then, they brought in Norman Riley Raine, who had just done The Life of Emile Zola. And then, as always, time was running out, and they brought in Seton I. Miller, who was under contract and had done several pictures at Warner Brothers. And he worked along with Norman Riley Raine in developing the script.
So work was progressing, research, preparations, script writing, and in the midst of this, Jimmy Cagney had his ultimate blow-up with Hal Wallis and Jack Warner.
James Cagney, in one of his many disputes with Warner Brothers, walked off the lot. So for two and a half years, he was not doing a Warner Brothers picture.
Well, now, a lot of time and money had been invested in this production of Robin Hood, and they didn't have their Robin Hood.
Okay, let's forget about Robin Hood. Now, Captain Blood comes out in 1935.
It's the world against us, and us against the world.
Suddenly, Captain Blood with swashbuckling elements, big production. Now, Errol Flynn is a big star. So they say, wait a minute, what about Errol Flynn for Robin Hood? Hence, Mr. Cagney, he was forgotten, and Errol Flynn was now the star of the moment.
What sort of a man are you,
Faith, I'm the sort of man you like, my dear.
Errol Flynn was born in Tasmania and may be the only celebrity or well-known person to ever come out of that island south of Australia. And he actually did an acting job on an early production of The Bounty Saga. He played Fletcher Christian.
I have only one favor to beg, that you grant me the bounty. Make fast the foresail and leave me to run before the wind.
And then he drifted to Hollywood, and he got a contract at Warner Brothers They didn't know exactly what to do with him.
They really didn't have anybody at that time under contract at the studio to do Captain Blood. When they lost Robert Donat, who was originally scheduled to do Captain Blood, what they finally did was test Errol Flynn. Well, apparently they were very pleased with the test. So Flynn, coming from nowhere, was given the lead in one of their biggest pictures at that time.
All right, my hearties, follow me!
He was athletically inclined. He moved well. He had the bravado. And of course, he spoke with the British dialect so that you had the feeling that, hey, this guy could be Robin Hood.
But he was a devilishly handsome guy, great sense of humor, didn't take himself too seriously.
It's such a definitive Errol Flynn film to us now, and you can't imagine anybody being better than Errol Flynn in this movie.
As good of an actor as James Cagney was, and he was terrific, it's hard to see him doing this same number.
It's an interesting concept to think of James Cagney in his little green outfit, this little short fellow running around Sherwood Forest. He's such a tough little guy. It would have been interesting.
2 for 1.
Now, the Fairbanks film in 1922 had been a big success. In fact, it was Doug Fairbanks Sr.'s most successful film, and it was a very expensive production. But they really didn't want to emulate the Fairbanks film. The one thing that they did do, they wanted Flynn to have the swashbuckling characteristics, in part, the leaping, the vaulting, the scaling, obviously the sword play, and it all made sense, but it was a kind of a bow to the heritage of Doug Fairbanks Sr. Well, with Robin Hood, they knew that they had, the potential was going to be something. For Robin Hood, they decided, not early on, but as time progressed, we're going to do this in glorious Technicolor.
Color was not a new idea. It was a question of technology more than anything else to bring it to fruition. In the earliest days of films, they were often hand-painted, hand-tinted.
Of course, that was very time-consuming and wasn't very practical. Nothing was really perfected until a man named Herbert Kalmus perfected the 3-color Technicolor system.
People weren't, for the most part, doing pictures in Technicolor that were just, average contemporary films. There were exceptions, such as A Star is Born, that David O. Selznick did to kind of promote the Technicolor process so that it could be used for other things other than musicals and spectacles. But for the most part, musicals, great idea. The Wizard of Oz, terrific. Robin Hood, hey, the forest scenes.
So the addition of color to Robin Hood not only meant it would be a more expensive movie to make, but it also heralded a more ambitious motion picture. Again, the first thought always was to use the talent that was already there at the studio being paid on a week-to-week basis. So Hal Wallace assigned a contract director named William Keighley.
He was a very urbane, sophisticated, relatively quiet, soft-spoken gentleman. He had been on the stage, both as an actor and as a director in the theater.
I can't say anything disparaging about William Keighley. He made a lot of good movies. He was a very capable studio director. He made everything from G-Men with Jimmy Cagney to The Man Who Came to Dinner.
He had done The Prince and the Pauper with Flynn in '37. He had also done the first 3-strip Technicolor picture at Warner's called God's Country and the Woman. And he had worked with Flynn, so that was good. Flynn liked him. And he was also very enthusiastic about the subject.
Many directors say that casting is 90% of their job. That if they cast the right actor, they're home free.
But the film is so wonderfully cast. I mean, you can't get a better villain than Basil Rathbone or Claude Rains and, wonderful character actors like Alan Hale and all of them. I mean, it's such a great mix. It's one of those wonderful accidents that everything clicked and everything was right.
There was probably no better casting on the screen than Errol Flynn as Robin Hood and Olivia de Havilland as Maid Marian, because there was a magic there. First of all, they were very beautiful people. I mean, Errol Flynn in his prime was a dashing figure. And Olivia was one of the great beauties of Hollywood. And she was having a bit of a romance going with Flynn at this time. The romance between them and the intelligence had to play in so many dreadful B pictures and silly comedies.
They were putting her in films that she felt were not very good, and she wanted to be a good actress and a successful actress.
And she did revolt, and finally she sued the company and got out of her contract.
So she was really flirting with career suicide by doing that, because if she had lost the case, she probably wouldn't have worked in Hollywood again. But it is in the law books today, the de Havilland decision. And as Betty Davis always said, you know, every actor in the business owes a great debt of gratitude for Olivia de Havilland for doing that.
Olivia remains a patron saint of the Screen Actors Guild because she had the guts to challenge Jack Warner and win.
A hero can't really be heroic in the old-fashioned sense unless he has an adversary. And this film, of course, provides three.
Basil Rathbone was a wonderful actor on the stage and very successful on the stage. And in films, he played two distinctly different people. He played either villains or the superhero Sherlock Holmes. But he did wonderful things, but always as a villain or as a hero, but never anything in between.
Certainly in Robin Hood, he was just ideal, the epitome of evil.
Basil Rathbone is the perfect foil, the perfect enemy for Robin Hood because he is also very smart. And so there's as much a duel of wits as it is of...
If you look at the adventures of Robin Hood and examine the cast one by one, it's not possible to think of anybody who could play any of those parts better. It is a perfect cast, and it's a perfectly cast movie.
I always remember the first Robin Hood with Douglas Fairbanks, as they just went through like this. You and I are fencing, and I'm doing this, and you're doing this. And it became a sword fight.
Fred Cavens helped figure out a more vivid and realistic way of staging sword fights for this film and defined what a really great movie sword fight should look like.
He had staged the duel in Captain Blood, and he was the one, in my opinion, who really brought style to screen fencing. He said it was a fight, it wasn't a fencing exhibition. And he believed that everything should be magnified.
Fred Cavens was Hollywood sword master who knew this sort of thing and who trained actors in being good swordsmen.
And he also said there must be a routine because it's somewhat like a dance number. You know, you deal in phrases and in counts. You don't have two guys up there knife sharpening. That doesn't work. And he was always very strong on, you know, a spectacular looking fight, but it still looked like a fight. And Al Cavens, who was Fred Cavens' son, was also working with his father and was particularly in charge of the quarterstaff fighting.
I came on the scene because Errol Flynn on The Master of Ballantrae was the first film I did. That's how I got to know him. You couldn't have got a better man to do a Robin Hood. First of all, he was a good swordsman by that time. His favourite sword was... no matter what you did, he did that. And all you could do is go back like this, and then he'd thrust and you'd parry and carry on with the fight. So, flamboyant. He was very flamboyant. And Basil Rathbone, damn good swordsman in his own right.
You had a lot of rehearsing with these people because they knew they were going to have a big climactic sword fight at the end. So there's lots of tables and candles and candle stands and the stairway, and all of this kind of got into the act. All of these things were the touches.
In my mind, still the master of the sword.
Well, the choice of the art director on Robin Hood is interesting because they felt that here we're dealing with a castle, you know, that You can't get expressionistic, or you shouldn't, in something like this, versus other pictures where they could, do an interpretation or do. But here, it's Norman architecture of the 12th century. It's pretty much, this is the way it has to look.
Carl Jules Weil was a very famous architect, but was a great illustrator himself. But the art directors themselves worked, and then a lot of the illustrators worked with him. And you'd kind of work in their style, so you learn to adapt to the styles that the art director would like.
And they wanted it to look architecturally proper. Now, romanticized, of course. The whole picture's romanticized. It was a fairy tale illustrated by Technicolor, not a documentary on medieval life. This was not what they were trying to do.
Mr. Weil would always come up and talk for a few minutes and tell you a little bit about the story, tell you what he had in mind. But if you have something better, to give it to me. He was just terrific to work for. And his work showed one of the jobs of a good art director is to find appropriate locations.
They decided for Robin Hood to go up to Chico, California. We're talking 400-odd miles, and this was a big deal. It's a natural park, Bidwell Park, with oaks and sycamores and vines and this big creek running right through the middle. It was a perfect setting for the film. In any case, there were all kinds of discussions about we don't want to get carried away, we don't want to spend too much money, as usual. Even the production manager of the studio, Tenny Wright, said, are we really right in going up to Chico to shoot for several weeks the Sherwood Forest scenes? We're going to be getting there at the end of September, and the rains are going to start. But it was a calculated risk, and they did run into bad weather when they went up there. But anyway, the decision was made, and they were up there shooting for 6 weeks. There they were up in this beautiful forest, but it didn't have any rocks. So they had to bring prop rocks up to augment what was there. And they had to spray the foliage because fall was there. They wanted green. So they're spraying the green on things. And they brought up some prop trunks of trees so that they could place them in the foreground. And it all seems kind of ridiculous, but it worked. So Carl Jules Weil did augment the scenery up there. And once again, it was supposed to be prettified and romanticized versus gritty. This was not a gritty forest.
It is even more Sherwood Forest than the real Sherwood Forest in England. It had to be that way. And while it is set in that sort of fantasy 12th century, and the costumes are not particularly historically accurate, they convey a reality to them. They convey that sense of this is what it must have been like.
But I think that Carl Weil and the other art directors at Warner Brothers had that influence.
Costume designers under contract at the time. And Milo Anderson was given Robin Hood. And he did a beautiful job. And it was a romanticized job. He also said that working with Olivia de Havilland was interesting because Olivia de Havilland had her own ideas on certain things, not overbearing, but she would do research and come in with some thoughts. As always, the costuming and the makeup reflect the period in which the picture was made. So when you look at the eyebrows on Olivia de Havilland and you look at the makeup, it's late 37, early 38. So you proceeded very carefully to blend the historic with the contemporary so that it didn't jar people looking at it historically, nor did it look funny for people who were only concerned about what was happening in today's world, 1937, 38 world. Now, in those days particularly, if you're doing a period picture, they wore wigs. A large percentage of the male players wore wigs. And Flynn, of course, had his wig. And he doesn't like the wig. So he writes to Hal Wallace, the executive producer at Warner's, Hal, this wig, I loathe the bloody thing. And Hal Wallace back at the studio, let's make Errol happy, do another wig. So they did another wig, sort of following the little sketch that he did in his letter. And when Flynn came back, he had a new wig, and he was happy with his new wig. Well, William Keighley finished shooting in Chico, came back and started in with some of the less spectacular scenes, I guess to give him a little bit of a breather, some of the smaller interior scenes, and then started the archery tournament over at the old Busch Gardens in Pasadena. It's been gone for decades. But at that time, it was a beautiful estate with gardens. They shot many things there, the Wilkes Barbecue from Gone with the Wind. So they were shooting over there, and now they were way behind schedule, cumulatively. The money was growing rapidly, the budget.
William Keighley was ill-cast to direct The Adventures of Robin Hood because he didn't know action.
They were watching the rushes, and it wasn't coming out quite with the style and the panache that they wanted.
Their solution, as it was many times, was to think, well, who can we get? Who can fix? Who can help?
Jack L. Warner, the head of the studio, and Hal Wallace, the executive producer, said, you know, why don't we turn this thing over to Curtiz?
That would be their #1 troubleshooter, Mike Curtiz.
So there was a changing of the guard.
Well, Michael Curtiz was a strange figure among the directors at Warner Brothers. He was born a Hungarian and worked in Hungarian films and in German films before coming to Warner Brothers.
And he was considered one of the top guys at Warner Brothers. Now, he had directed Flynn in Captain Blood, which made Flynn a star. And he was a very imaginative man, very tough man. A lot of actors, you know, weren't thrilled with Mike Curtiz. And Mike was not big for lunch breaks. he always was in there, and he was very tense, and he could be difficult. And of course, Flynn liked Keighley. Keighley was very urbane, sophisticated, soft-spoken, and the two of them got along very well.
Curtiz was valued by Jack Warner because he was a fast shooter.
His range was extraordinary. I mean, he did Yankee Doodle Dandy. You know, he did The Sea Wolf. He did Mildred Pierce.
He could do comedies. He could do westerns, adventure films, melodramas.
Black and white, Technicolor, what have you. Mystery of the Wax Museum, Kennel Murder Case.
And Casablanca, which was his crowning glory.
You look at those old films when they show up on Turner Classic Movies, you think, gee, this guy was terrific. You know, he was a good director. And he approached everything with this same zeal and this, you know, this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread.
So that was why Jack Warner liked him.
Now, it ended up where both of them got credit on the screen.
But they did that a lot in those days. Today, that would be probably kind of a scandal if a director was taken off a film midway in production. But in those days, they did that a lot. Somebody would come in and maybe even do just a musical number in some film, or do a, you know, action sequence in a film. They all helped each other out, and nobody thought anything about that.
There are more stuntmen used in this picture, more than any other up to that time. Well, obviously, the Robin Hood legend, we have the archery, we have swordplay, we've got the...
When they're all finished, they'd spent $2 million. That's $1938, when you could still go to a movie for 10 cents or a quarter. And it was the most expensive movie Warner Brothers had ever made up to that point.
As good as the other studios were, I think all of us who care about this music have a soft spot in our hearts for Warner Brothers. And the idea that there was a moment where Warner Brothers had Steiner, Korngold, and Waxman all in the same building is already like the history of music and cinema and dramatic music is all like encapsulated in Warner Brothers.
At that time at Warner's, Max Steiner had joined the staff of composers, and he was the workhorse of Warner Brothers. He went from picture to picture. So he was considered one of the great composers of motion picture scores. So Max was kind of put down as the guy who was going to score this. But then they thought, wait a minute, we're going all out. Let's get Erich Wolfgang Korngold.
I mean, it's not a logical choice because he was not a composer of action. His operas are all atmospheric. But of course, it turns out to have been a brilliant choice because sometimes doing it slightly against type works. And of course, he had a relationship with Errol Flynn movies.
At that time, Korngold had been primarily involved in concert work, operas, you know, and so-called serious music, and was a child prodigy and so forth.
The greatest, perhaps, child prodigy of all time. People look at Mozart, they look at Mendelssohn, they look at Korngold.
It just so happened that the new opera that Korngold was in Vienna getting ready for had to be postponed. Just at that time, he gets this wire from Henry Blanke, the producer on the film, and Wallace, saying, "Can you come back to do Robin Hood?"
Literally, he and his wife had a day to close up the house, and they decided to go.
He's going to do Robin Hood. He's thinking of Robin Hood all the way. He's composing themes, and he's doing this on the ship, and then taking the train across the country.
They finally got to L.A., and that's when he saw the picture, and that was the terrible moment when he said, "I can't write this."
He liked the movie, but he just thought, I just can't do this and remain, satisfied that I can do a good job.
His heart sunk because he thought there was so much action and that he didn't actually describe action. I can say in retrospect that the hardest thing for a composer to write is music to accompany any kind of battle or any kind of sword fight because of the number of notes you have to come out with. I mean, either you're writing and people are like, or you're writing
So they sent Leo Forbstein, who was the head of Warner's music department at the time, over to see Korngold and to implore him.
Well, this is a kind of a scene from a movie, if you think about it. It is absolutely, it's like his life became a movie.
Just as Forbstein arrived, there was a call where they said, his friends of Korngold said that Hitler is meeting in Berchtesgaden with Chancellor Schuschnigg of Austria.
That only can mean one thing, and that means that the Anschluss is going to happen.
Of course, Korngold was Viennese and had, his home in Austria and so forth. And then things got worse. Then they confiscated his home and, they were trying to get his family out of the country.
Korngold's got his teenage son over there and his parents. Lucy Korngold, Mrs. Korngold, has tried to make sure that her teenage boy who's over there is on somebody's passport to get him out. And in point of fact, amazingly enough, Korngold's parents and their son, Ernst, are on the last train, the absolute last train which you could leave Austria without special permission. Because the next day, everybody who tried to get out would have to have special papers. They got out, and Ernst told me that he actually sat on the lap of a Nazi soldier to get out of Austria.
It was one of those dramatic stories that was happening to so many emigres of the time.
It's a kind of breathtaking moment when you think about how close that was, because they had relatives and friends who were arrested and died in concentration camps. But when Korngold said, actually, my life was saved by Robin Hood, he meant it.
He wrote a marvelous score, and it's one of the great scores. He conducted his own music, obviously. His sense of timing was superb.
Sometimes, in fact, he chose the key of the accompanimental music based on the key of the speaking words of the actor. See, I'm talking right now, and if I just slow down, then that is the note I'm talking on, and that would be the key that Korngold would accompany me in right now. You see, and no one ever would have thought in those terms. He was telling stories. They were for him operas without singers.
And as a result, you talk about an added dimension. I mean, it's a superb added dimension. It's one of the great scores.
It is some of the most dazzlingly brilliant music ever written. But the scene in which Korngold shows something unprecedented is the so-called love music. The love music accompanies a scene in which
they had a preview, the first preview in Pomona, California, of The Adventures of Robin Hood, right after the score was finished. Of course, the preview process, was essentially to see how your picture was doing. Where are the weak spots? Where are the parts that we have to fix or revise, or in some cases reshoot, or just quietly forget about the movie? And in the case of Robin Hood, it was a total smash. People are absolutely going crazy over this movie at the preview. There wasn't any change made to anything. That was it. And Wallace is wiring Warner, or Warner's they're back and forth saying, never in the history of our company have we ever had a response to something like this. The crowds went, what? Then they had another preview at Warner's downtown theater. That was even bigger, if you can believe it, than the one we had in Pomona as far as the reception was concerned. Then they had a one at the Warner Hollywood Theater, which was for the press and everybody, and that was a complete smash. So they were saying, there's no question about this going to be a big hit, which it had to have been at $2 million. I mean, if it hadn't, it would have been a major disaster for Warner Brothers at that time. There had been so much care taken with this picture, particularly as time went by in the shooting and in the post-production, that everything was taken care of and all of the holes were plugged. And, you know, now this isn't always the case. You can take care of a lot of things but still find out it doesn't work. But in this case, it all worked. Well, the film opened and was an immediate success on all levels, you know, in the big cities and in the small towns, which is important because some pictures are geared more for a very, very sophisticated audience. It opened at Radio City Music Hall, which in those days was a big deal, and it played for weeks. And people did go back. They wanted to see it again and again because it had that kind of charm. And of course, you know, Academy Awards, they were there then.
In those days, I will say that there were 10 nominees for Best Picture, unlike 5 that we have today. So you did have a better chance. But it does show how well thought of that film was by the Academy voters that it would be up for Best Picture of the Year. It lost in 1938 to You Can't Take It With You, the Capra film. And it won 3 technical awards.
It did get Best Score, Erich Wolfgang Korngold, Best Art Direction, Carl Jules Weil, and Best Editing, Ralph Dawson.
It's interesting that Michael Curtiz was up for directing 4 Daughters that year and also had directed Adventures of Robin Hood, both of which were up for the Best Picture of the Year.
And Hal B. Wallace, the executive producer, got the Irving Thalberg Award of the Year, which was a very prestigious award. And 10 years later, in 1948, after World War II, Warner's reissued it on a single bill with new Technicolor prints, new advertising campaign, and it was a smash all over again. It did well in every respect, critically, award-wise, you know, at the box office, and as a perennial favorite that was reissued. Plus later on in television, plus, you know, DVDs.
The best Robin Hood ever made.